I'm Georgia, 34, female, and my brother pretended to reconcile with our cancer-stricken father just to manipulate him into disinheriting me. It was a long and calculated campaign of poison, one that nearly succeeded. But he made one mistake. He underestimated me, and he didn't know that our father, in his confusion, had started recording everything. Those recordings didn't just expose my brother's lies. They became the key to reclaiming my father's true legacy and winning a battle I never thought I'd have to fight. Our family was never a Norman Rockwell painting, but for most of my life, it felt like a sturdy, reliable structure. My father, Richard, was the foundation, a man of quiet strength and deeply ingrained principles. My mother was the heart, filling our home with warmth and laughter until she was taken from us by a sudden illness a decade ago. After that, it was just Dad, my younger brother Ethan, and me. We were the three pillars left standing, and I thought that meant we'd hold each other up. I was wrong. The moment one pillar started to crumble, the other revealed it was rotten to the core. I was always the responsible one. As an architect, my life is about structure, planning, and ensuring things are built to last. It's a trait I inherited from my father, who worked as a civil engineer. We understood each other on a fundamental level. We spoke the same language of logic and legacy. Ethan, on the other hand, spoke a language of impulse and opportunity. He was the charming, restless whirlwind to my calm, steady presence. 3 years my junior, he'd always been the one to test boundaries, to talk his way out of trouble, and to leave others to clean up his messes. More often than not, I was that other. I remember one stark example from when he was 20. He'd borrowed Dad's prized vintage sedan for a night out. The call came at 2 a.m. It was Ethan on the line, but a local police officer. Ethan had wrapped the car around a telephone pole. He was thankfully unharmed, but the car was a mangled wreck. I drove out to the scene, my heart pounding with dread. I found Dad standing by the side of the road, his face a mask of disappointment, looking at the twisted metal that used to be his weekend project. Ethan was a few feet away, kicking at the curb and complaining to the officer about the slippery road. He didn't once apologize to Dad. "It's just a car, Dad," he'd fumed later at home. "We have insurance. I don't see what the big deal is." I spent the next 2 days dealing with the insurance claim, arranging for the tow, and most importantly, sitting with Dad in his garage, listening to him talk about every dent he'd hammered out and every part he'd polished. I didn't do it for praise. I did it because it was my father, and he was hurting. Ethan slept until noon and then left to hang out with his friends. It was a pattern that would define our lives. A few years later, the mess was financial. Ethan, then in his mid-20s, came to Dad with a can't-miss business proposal. It was a tech startup involving some kind of social media app that was, in his words, guaranteed to be the next big thing. He had charts, projections, and a tidal wave of infectious enthusiasm. He needed $50,000 in seed money. I looked over his flimsy business plan. As an architect, I know what a solid blueprint looks like, and this wasn't it. It was full of buzzwords and empty promises. "Dad, I really don't think this is a good idea," I'd said gently in the kitchen one evening. "The numbers don't add up. It's too risky." Ethan overheard me. "You just don't get it, Georgia," he snapped, his charm instantly evaporating into resentment. "You're too cautious. You can't see the big picture. You just want me to fail so you can stay the good one." The accusation stung, but what hurt more was seeing the look on my father's face. He was caught between his sensible daughter and his charismatic son. In the end, the dreamer won. Dad gave Ethan the money. 6 months later, the startup had folded, the app never launched, and the money was gone. Ethan claimed a business partner had betrayed him. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of my warning, just a sullen bitterness that lingered for months. Dad never spoke of the loss, but I knew it had set back his retirement plans by years. From then on, Ethan's presence in our lives became sporadic. He drifted from city to city, from one failed venture to the next, always calling when he needed something but rarely just to talk. Holidays became my responsibility. I hosted Thanksgiving, bought the Christmas presents for our extended family, and made sure Dad's birthday was always celebrated. Ethan would usually send a last-minute text. "Sorry, can't make it. Swamped with work." Love to Dad. I knew he wasn't swamped, he was just absent. My partner, Mark, saw the dynamic clearly. He was a lawyer, trained to see patterns of behavior, and he worried about the toll it took. On me, "He takes your dad for granted, George," he'd say, using his pet name for me as he helped me set the table for another Thanksgiving for two. "And he takes you for granted." I would just sigh, "He's my brother, Mark, it's just how he is." I had accepted it. I had accepted my role as the constant, the reliable daughter who would always be there, and Ethan's role as the prodigal son who might never come home. I thought I understood the architecture of my family completely, but I had failed to account for the destructive power of a terminal diagnosis and the lengths a desperate man would go to when he smelled an opportunity born from tragedy. The day the world tilted on its axis began with a phone call from my father. His voice was thin, reedy, stripped of its usual quiet authority. He'd been having tests done for a persistent cough and fatigue. He asked if I could come with him to get the results. "The doctor said to bring someone," he'd said, and a cold dread washed over me. In the sterile, beige-colored consultation room, the oncologist spoke in calm, measured tones, but his words were bombs. Stage IV lung cancer. Inoperable. Palliative care was the only option. The prognosis was stark. A year, maybe 18 months if the treatment was effective at slowing the spread. I held my father's hand as the doctor explained the next steps. It felt like I was outside my own body, watching a scene from a movie. This couldn't be happening. My father, Richard, the foundation of my world, was crumbling. I went into architect mode, into practical mode, because it was the only way to keep from shattering. I asked questions about chemotherapy schedules, pain management, and home care options. I took meticulous notes on a pad I'd brought, my handwriting the only steady thing in the room. My father just sat there, looking smaller than I had ever seen him, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the wall. Driving him home, the silence in the car was heavier than stone. When we pulled into his driveway, he finally turned to me, his eyes full of a terrifying vulnerability. "Don't tell Ethan yet," he whispered. "I don't want to worry him." "Dad, he needs to know," I said softly. "Not yet, Georgia, please." I honored his wish for a week. A terrible, agonizing week where I'd call him 3 times a day and visit every evening after work, bringing food he barely touched. I'd sit with him, talking about anything and everything except the shadow that now loomed over us. Finally, with his permission, I made the call. I found Ethan's number and braced myself. As expected, it went to voicemail. I left a message, my voice cracking despite my best efforts. "Ethan, it's Georgia. Call me back as soon as you get this. It's about Dad. It's important." He called back 2 hours later. He sounded distracted, like I'd interrupted something. I told him plainly, "Dad has cancer, it's terminal." There was a pause on the other end of the line. I waited for the shock, the grief, the questions. Instead, what I got was a detached, almost corporate-sounding response. "Wow, that's tough. How long does he have?" "A year, maybe more. They don't know for sure," I said, feeling a surge of anger at his clinical tone. "He needs us, Ethan." "Right, yeah, of course," he said. "Listen, I'm in the middle of a huge deal right now. Let me see if I can clear some things up and I'll try to get out there in a few weeks. Send him my love." And then he was gone. I hung up the phone, shaking with a mixture of rage and despair. Mark wrapped his arms around me. "What did he say?" he asked. "He'll try to get here in a few weeks," I repeated, the words tasting like ash. "He's in the middle of a huge deal." Mark's expression was grim. "I'm sorry, George, I'm so sorry." For the next 2 weeks, life was a blur of oncology appointments and pharmacy runs. I arranged for a home health aide to be with Dad during the day while I was at work. Mark was my rock, researching legal documents we'd need, like a healthcare proxy and power of attorney, and just holding me when the weight of it all became too much. Ethan sent a single text message, "Thinking of you guys. Hang in there." Then one Sunday afternoon, my phone rang. It was Ethan. "Hey, George," he said, his voice unusually bright. I've been doing a lot of thinking. This whole thing with Dad, it's a wake-up call. I've been a terrible son and a terrible brother. I was so stunned I couldn't speak. I'm dropping everything, he continued, his voice thick with manufactured emotion. The deal fell through, and I'm taking it as a sign. Nothing is more important than family. I'm packing up my car. I'm coming home. I want to be there for Dad. A dizzying, treacherous wave of hope washed over me. Could this be real? Was the reality of losing our father finally breaking through his years of selfishness? I wanted to believe it. I needed to believe it. For Dad's sake, I needed a partner in this, not another problem to manage. Ethan, are you serious? I asked, my voice trembling. Never been more serious in my life, he said. I'll be there in 2 days. When I told Mark, he was cautiously optimistic for my sake, but I saw the skepticism in his eyes. People can change, George, he said, choosing his words carefully. Let's just see what happens. 2 days later, Ethan's beat-up car pulled into Dad's driveway. He stepped out, looking older and more tired than I remembered, but he had a determined look on his face. He walked right past me and went straight to Dad, who was sitting on the porch. Ethan dropped to his knees, hugged our father's legs, and started to cry. I'm so sorry, Dad, he sobbed. I'm so sorry for everything. I'm here now. I'm not going anywhere. Watching them, my own eyes filled with tears. Maybe Mark was wrong. Maybe this was real. Maybe, at the 11th hour, Ethan had finally come home. For the first few weeks, it was like living in a dream. Ethan was the prodigal son returned, transformed into a model of devotion. He moved into his old bedroom in Dad's house, insisting he wanted to be there around the clock. He learned how to manage Dad's medication schedule, cooked his favorite meals, and sat with him for hours, listening to old stories or watching classic movies. He was patient, attentive, and filled the house with a light, cheerful energy that had been missing for so long. Dad blossomed under the attention. A little bit of the old sparkle returned to his eyes. He seemed less tired, more engaged. He would talk endlessly about how proud he was of Ethan. He's really turned a corner, Georgia, Dad told me one afternoon, his voice full of wonder. It took this terrible illness to do it, but my boy is back. I wanted to believe it with every fiber of my being. I praised Ethan, thanked him, and felt a profound sense of relief. The burden was no longer mine to carry alone. But slowly, subtly, like a hairline crack appearing in a foundation, things began to shift. The first time I noticed it was almost insignificant. I had spent a Sunday afternoon cooking a week's worth of healthy, low-sodium meals for Dad, designed to be easy on his system during chemo. I packed them in neat containers and brought them over. Ethan greeted me at the door with a bright smile. Hey, George, that's so thoughtful. He took the containers and placed them in the fridge. Later, as I was sitting with Dad, Ethan came into the living room holding the menu for a local pizza place. I was thinking we'd get your favorite tonight, Dad, Ethan said. The Meat Lovers Extravaganza. What do you say? Dad's eyes lit up. Oh, I don't know if I should. Nonsense, Ethan said, shooting a quick glance at me. You deserve a treat. George's meals are wonderful, of course, but a little bland. A man's got to live a little, right? He said it with a laugh, as if it were a joke, but the barb landed. He was painting me as the controlling health warden and himself as the fun-loving champion of Dad's happiness. I saw Dad hesitate, then nod eagerly. I didn't say a word, not wanting to spoil the mood. A week later, the crack widened. I had a major deadline at my firm, a final presentation for a community library project I had poured my heart into for months. I called Dad that morning to let him know I'd be late visiting. I'll be there around 8, Dad, I promise, I said. Don't worry about it, honey. Your work is important, he said, though his voice sounded a little flat. When I arrived that night, exhausted but carrying a small model of the library to show him, the atmosphere in the house was strange. Ethan was fluffing Dad's pillows while Dad stared blankly at the TV. There she is, Ethan announced cheerfully. The busy career woman, we were wondering if you'd make it. Sorry I'm late, I said, forcing a smile. The presentation went really well. Look, Dad, I wanted to show you. "That's nice, dear," Dad said, barely glancing at the model. Later, as I was leaving, Ethan walked me to the door. "He was really down today," he said in a low, conspiratorial voice. "He waits for you all day, you know. I try to tell him you're busy, that your work has always come first, but he takes it personally." "That's not fair, Ethan," I whispered, furious. "You know how important this project was, and I'm here every single day." I know," he said, holding his hands up in a gesture of peace. "I'm just telling you how he feels. I'm the one here all day, I see it." The poison was beginning to work. Ethan was positioning himself as the selfless caregiver and me as the ambitious, detached daughter. He was a master of twisting my strengths, my stable career, my practicality, my lack of drama, into weaknesses. When Mark and I sat down with Dad to discuss the healthcare proxy, Ethan had a pained expression on his face the whole time. The moment we finished, he ushered Mark and me into the hall. "Do you guys have to be so morbid?" he hissed. "Power of attorney, living wills, you're stressing him out. It's like you're just waiting for him to die. Why can't we just enjoy the time we have left?" He was framing my responsibility as ghoulish impatience. The worst part was, it was working. Dad started to pull away from me. Our conversations became stilted. He'd look at me with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. It was a mix of love, sadness, and a flicker of deep disappointment. When I tried to talk to him about it, he'd just shake his head. "I'm just tired, Georgia. The treatments take a lot out of me." But I knew it was more than that. The house I grew up in was starting to feel like foreign territory. Ethan was the gatekeeper. He answered the phone, he managed the visitors, he spoke for our father. I was being slowly, methodically, and brilliantly edged out of my own family. And I was so consumed with anticipatory grief and a desperate desire for unity that I didn't see it for what it was, a hostile takeover. The last few months of my father's life were a watercolor painting left out in the rain. The vibrant colors of the man he once was bled away, leaving a pale, blurry version of him behind. The cancer was relentless, and the chemotherapy ravaged what little strength he had left. He spent most of his days in a hospital bed we'd set up in the living room, drifting in and out of a medicated haze. And through it all, Ethan was ever present. He became a fortress around my father. My visits felt stilted and supervised. Ethan would hover, answering questions directed at Dad, cutting in with an anecdote about something funny that happened that day, effectively blocking any real connection I might make. If I tried to have a moment alone with Dad, Ethan would suddenly remember it was time for his medication or that he needed to be repositioned. I was an outsider, a guest in the theater of my father's final days, and Ethan was the director, producer, and star of the show. The distance between my father and me grew into a chasm. I felt like I was screaming across it, but my voice was gone. The final, most painful conversation we ever had happened on a gray Tuesday afternoon. Ethan had conveniently stepped out to run an errand. Dad was lucid, his eyes clear for the first time in weeks. I was holding his hand, trying to tell him about a new project at work, when he squeezed my hand weakly. "Georgia," he said, his voice a dry rasp, "I've been thinking." "What about Dad?" I asked, leaning in, desperate for a connection. He looked at me, and his eyes were filled with a profound, aching sadness that I now know was confusion and regret. "I just wish you made more time," he said. "You've been so busy, so focused on everything else." He took a shaky breath. "Ethan, he gave up everything to be here. He really stepped up when it mattered. I see that now." The words were like a physical blow. They knocked the air from my lungs. Every evening visit, every weekend spent cleaning his house, every carefully cooked meal, every late-night call with a nurse, all of it was erased. In his mind, I had been absent. "Dad, that's not true," I stammered, tears blurring my vision. I've been here the whole time." "It's all right," he said, turning his head away, a gesture of finality that broke my heart. "I'm just tired now." I left the house that day feeling utterly shattered. I cried the whole way home, a gut-wrenching, silent scream of a cry. Mark held me as I fell apart, and for the first time, he let his own anger show. "This is Ethan," he said, his voice hard. This is all his doing. He's been poisoning your father against you, and it's a classic tactic of manipulators. He isolated him and created a new reality. I knew he was right, but it didn't matter. The words had come from my father. 2 weeks later, he passed away in his sleep. Ethan was the one who found him. Ethan was the one who called me, his voice thick with a sorrow that I now know was 90% performance. The funeral was a haze of black suits, hushed condolences, and casseroles from sympathetic neighbors. I moved through it like a ghost, my grief a complicated, tangled mess of loss, love, and the bitter sting of that final conversation. Ethan played the part of the bereaved, devoted son to perfection, accepting sympathies with a tragic, noble air. The reading of the will was scheduled for the following week at the office of a lawyer I didn't recognize. That should have been my first clue. Dad's longtime family lawyer had retired a few years back, but I'd expected him to use the firm he'd always trusted. This was someone new. We sat in a sterile conference room, me, Mark, and Ethan. The lawyer, a man with a professionally somber face, cleared his throat and began to read. He skipped through the usual legal jargon until he got to the disposition of the estate. "To my beloved daughter, Georgia," he read, and I held my breath, in disappointment. T for her distance and lack of support during my final, most difficult months. I leave the token sum of $10,000, with the hope that she will use it to reflect on the importance of family. I couldn't breathe. It felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Token sum, disappointment, distance. My father's final words from beyond the grave were a condemnation. The lawyer continued, his voice droning on. "All the rest, residue, and remainder of my estate, both real and personal, including my primary residence, my savings, and my investment portfolio, I give devise and bequeath to my beloved son, Ethan, who showed me true devotion in my final days and proved himself to be a man of great character and love. It is my wish that he use this inheritance to build a stable and prosperous life for himself." I stared across the table at my brother. He had his head bowed, and he brought a hand up to his face to cover a sob, but I saw it. Just for a second, before his hand covered his face, I saw a flicker of triumph in his eyes, a flash of pure, unadulterated victory. He had won, he had played the long game, and he had won everything. I wasn't just disinherited, I was erased. My entire life of being the responsible, loving daughter had been rewritten in a single, cruel paragraph. In that moment, the grief turned to ice in my veins. It was a cold, hard, clarifying fury. This wasn't my father. This was a monster wearing my brother's face. The days that followed the reading of the will were a thick, suffocating fog. I felt numb, disconnected from the world. The $10,000 check arrived in the mail, and I left it on the kitchen counter, unable to even look at it. It felt like blood money, a final, insulting tip for a lifetime of service. Ethan called multiple times, leaving tearful, rambling voicemails. "Georgia, I am so shocked," he'd say, his voice cracking artfully. "I had no idea Dad did that, I swear to you. He must have done it on his own. You know how he was at the end. I want to make this right. We can work something out." Mark listened to one of the messages with me, his jaw tight with contempt. "Don't call him back," he said firmly. "He's trying to manage you to see if you'll just accept this. He wants to give you a pittance to make you go away quietly. Don't engage." I took his advice. I blocked Ethan's number. I needed space to process the sheer scale of the betrayal. It wasn't about the money or the house. It was about the story that had been written into a legal document, a story that painted me as a cold, absentee daughter and him as a saint. It was a theft of my history, of my relationship with my father. About a month after the funeral, the inevitable task of clearing out Dad's house fell to me and Mark. Ethan had the keys, of course, but his lawyer had advised him to allow me access to retrieve any personal items. He left the key under the mat, too cowardly to face me. Walking into the house was brutal. It still smelled of him, a faint scent of old books and the antiseptic tang of his medication. Every object held a memory. His reading glasses on the nightstand, his favorite worn armchair. The photos on the mantelpiece of me and Ethan as gap-toothed kids, a lifetime before the rot set in. We worked in silence for hours, sorting things into boxes, donate, keep, trash. Mark was a quiet, steady presence, handling the heavier things while I focused on the small, personal items. In Dad's bedroom closet on the top shelf was a cardboard box with Georgia written on it in his familiar, slanted handwriting. My heart seized. I carefully lifted it down. Inside was a collection of things he had saved for me. My childhood drawings, my high school honor roll certificates, a dried corsage from my senior prom. And at the very bottom, beneath a stack of old photos, was a small, silver digital voice recorder. I frowned, picking it up. I vaguely remembered him buying it a few months into his chemotherapy. "It's my chemo brain helper," he had explained with a weak smile. "I forget things the nurses tell me, so I just record them." He'd been increasingly confused and forgetful, and this little device was his way of coping. I figured the box contained the last few things he'd put aside before he got too sick, and he must have just dropped the recorder in there. I slipped it into my pocket, not thinking much of it, and we continued our grim work. That night, I couldn't sleep. The image of the will, the cruel words, the look on Ethan's face, it all played on a loop in my mind. I got out of bed around 3 a.m. and went into the living room. I saw my jacket slung over a chair and remembered the recorder. On a whim, I found a charging cable that fit and plugged it in. A small red light came on. After about an hour, it turned green. I unplugged it, sat on the sofa in the silent darkness of my home, and pressed the play button. The first few files were what I expected, a recording of a nurse explaining a new medication, a garbled reminder to himself to call the pharmacy. Then I clicked on a file dated 3 months ago. I heard my father's voice, weak but clear. "I don't know, Ethan. Georgia has always been so good to me. It doesn't feel right." Then Ethan's voice, smooth and persuasive. "Dad, it's not about right, it's about what's fair. Look at her life. She's a successful architect. Mark's a lawyer. They're set. They don't need it. I have nothing, Dad. I'm starting from zero. You told me you wanted to see me build a stable life. This is your chance to give me that. It's the last thing you can do for me." My blood ran cold. I clicked to the next file. It was a phone call. Ethan must have had the recorder in his pocket, thinking it was off. He was speaking to someone, his voice low and arrogant. "Yeah, he's buying all of it. Hook, line, and sinker. The dutiful son act is working like a charm. No, she has no idea. She walks in here with her little containers of healthy food and her sad eyes, and she thinks I'm Saint Ethan of the bedside vigil. The lawyer appointment is on Tuesday. By then, the old man will be ready to sign anything I put in front of him. He's so confused most of the time, he barely knows what day it is." A strangled sob escaped my lips. It was real. The monstrous thing I had suspected was real. I frantically scrolled through the files. There were dozens of them. I played another one, and this was the worst. It was Ethan coaching my father. "Okay, Dad, let's go over it one more time," Ethan's voice said, patient and clear. "When Mr. Harrison asks you why you're changing the will, you just say you were disappointed in George's distance. Use that exact word, disappointed. It's a feeling. They can't argue with a feeling. And you say you were so proud of the way I stepped up. It makes it sound like it's your decision based on what you observed. It's legally sound. Do you understand?" "Disappointed," my father repeated, his voice frail and tired. "Disappointed in her distance." The same words from the will. The same words he had used in our last, terrible conversation. They weren't his words at all. They were a script. Ethan had fed them to him. I sat there in the dark, the small silver recorder clutched in my hand, tears streaming down my face. But these weren't just tears of grief. They were tears of vindication, of rage, of absolute, unwavering clarity. My brother hadn't just influenced my father. He had conducted a campaign of psychological warfare against a dying, vulnerable man. He thought he had committed the perfect crime. He thought he had erased me, but he had forgotten about the chemo brain helper. And in his arrogance, he had left behind a perfect, undeniable record of his betrayal. The fog of my grief finally lifted, and what was left was a core of pure steel. This wasn't over. It had just begun. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely dial the phone. It was almost 4 a.m., but I didn't care. Mark answered on the first ring, his voice thick with sleep but instantly alert. "Georgia, what's wrong?" "I found it," I whispered, my voice hoarse. "I found the proof, Mark. He recorded it. Dad recorded him." In a flood of words, I explained everything: the voice recorder, the coaching, the phone call. I told him the exact phrases Ethan had used, the ones that were echoed in the will and in my last conversation with my father. As a lawyer, Mark instantly grasped the colossal significance of what I had found. The sleepiness vanished from his voice, replaced by a sharp, focused intensity. "Don't touch anything," he commanded. "Don't delete any files. Don't even listen to them again. Make a copy of the files to a secure cloud drive right now, and then put the recorder in a safe place. This is it, George. This is everything. This is a textbook case of undue influence." The next morning, armed with a newfound sense of purpose, I texted Ethan from a new number. "We need to talk. Coffee shop on Main Street. Noon, just you and me." He agreed immediately, probably assuming I was ready to negotiate my cut of his stolen fortune. He was waiting at a small table when I arrived, a look of faux somber concern plastered on his face. "Georgia, I'm so glad you reached out," he began, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "I've been so worried about you. I want us to get through this together." I sat down and looked him directly in the eye, my expression devoid of any emotion. "I'm contesting the will, Ethan." His mask flickered. The concern vanished, replaced by a flash of annoyance. He quickly smoothed it over. "Georgia, don't do this," he said, leaning forward and lowering his voice. "You'll be dragging Dad's name through the mud. You'll make our family's private pain a public spectacle. Is that what you want? All for money." "It was never about the money," I said, my voice as cold and hard as steel. "It's about what you did." He scoffed, a genuine ugly sound. What I did, I was there for him, day in and day out, while you were busy with your blueprints and your fancy life. I held his hand. I changed his sheets. I earned his gratitude. He saw who was really there for him in the end. I let him finish his tirade. I let him build his tower of self-righteous lies. When he was done, I simply took my phone out of my purse, placed it on the table between us, and pressed play. I had chosen the file carefully. It was the one where he was on the phone, bragging to his friend. "Yeah, he's buying all of it. Hook, line, and sinker, thinks I'm Saint Ethan of the bedside vigil." The color drained from Ethan's face. His jaw went slack. The confident, charming man I had known my whole life seemed to shrink in his seat, turning pale and small. He stared at the phone as if it were a venomous snake. "The old man will be ready to sign anything I put in front of him." His own voice sneered from the speaker. He lunged for the phone, but I was faster. I snatched it back and stood up. "It's all there, Ethan," I said, my voice low but carrying across the quiet cafe. "Every lie, every manipulation, every single word you coached him to say. You didn't just influence him, you hijacked his mind, and you left behind the evidence." For the first time in his life, my brother was speechless. His bravado had crumbled, leaving only a pathetic, cornered panic in his eyes. He opened and closed his mouth like a fish, but no sound came out. "You'll be hearing from my lawyer," I said, and walked out without looking back. The next day, Mark introduced me to Alina Vance, one of the sharpest estate lawyers in the state. She was a woman in her 60s with piercing blue eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. We sat in her office as she listened to the most damning of the recordings. Her expression remained impassive, but I could see a flicker of steel in her eyes. When the recording finished, she simply said, "Mr. Harrison, your father's lawyer, is a reputable man, but he's old school. He would have taken your father's stated wishes at face value, especially with your brother's performance corroborating the story. Your brother was clever. But this," she tapped a pen on the legal pad in front of her, "this is a gift. Undue influence is notoriously difficult to prove. The burden is on you to show that your brother's actions subverted your father's true intent. These recordings are the smoking gun. They don't just suggest influence, they document the entire conspiracy from start to finish. The legal battle that followed was grueling. It was a slow, painful process of depositions, motions, and affidavits. Ethan's lawyer tried everything. He claimed the recordings were doctored. He tried to paint me as a greedy, vindictive daughter who was jealous of her brother's bond with their father. He argued that Dad was of sound mind and body when he made the new will. But the evidence was irrefutable. We had the recordings authenticated by a forensic audio expert. We had testimony from Dad's nurses, who noted Ethan's controlling behavior and how he often spoke for their father. We had family friends who testified to my lifelong devotion to my dad and their utter shock at the terms of the will. The process was draining, emotionally and financially. There were days I wanted to give up, to just walk away from the ugliness of it all. But then I would think of my father, frail and confused, being fed lines to repeat, being turned against his own daughter. And my resolve would harden all over again. This wasn't just a fight for an inheritance. It was a fight for the truth. It was a fight for my father's memory. The day of the final hearing was overcast and gray, the sky matching the mood in my heart. I sat at the plaintiff's table with Alina and Mark, a bundle of nerves and steely resolve. Across the courtroom, Ethan sat with his lawyer, looking pale and gaunt. He refused to meet my eye. The bravado he'd worn his entire life was gone, stripped away by months of legal scrutiny. All that was left was a hollowed-out shell of a man. The courtroom was a formal, intimidating space, but Alina navigated it with an air of calm authority. The centerpiece of our case was, of course, the recordings. Alina had the audio played for the court. Hearing my brother's cynical, bragging voice and my father's tired, coached responses echo through the silent room was excruciating. It was a public airing of our family's deepest wounds, a violation of what should have been private grief. But it was necessary. I looked at the judge, a woman with a stern but patient face. Her expression was unreadable, but she listened to every word with focused intensity. Ethan's lawyer put him on the stand, where he tried to claim the conversations were taken out of context, that he was simply role-playing to help his father articulate his feelings. Alina's cross-examination was surgical. "Mr. Last Name," she began, her voice calm, "in T. He recording from October 12th, you are heard on the phone saying, and I quote, 'The old man will be ready to sign anything I put in front of him. He's so confused most of the time, he barely knows what day it is.' Were you role-playing then as well?" Ethan stammered, I was exaggerating to a friend. It was just talk." "So you were lying to your friend, or you are lying to this court?" Alina asked, letting the question hang in the air. He had no answer. He crumbled on the stand, his web of lies disintegrating under the bright, unforgiving light of judicial review. Finally, after hours of testimony and legal arguments, the judge was ready to deliver her ruling. The room was deathly quiet. The court's primary duty in a case of this nature is to honor the true testamentary intent of the deceased, she began, looking out over the courtroom. It is clear from a lifetime of evidence that Mr. Richard Last Name was a fair and loving father to both his children. The question before this court is whether the will dated October 28th reflects his true intent, or if that intent was subverted by the actions of his son, Ethan. She paused, looking directly at my brother. "The audio evidence presented is, frankly, shocking," she continued, her voice sharp with disapproval. "It documents a calculated, predatory campaign of manipulation against a vulnerable, terminally ill man. The actions of the defendant, Mr. Ethan Last Name, were not those of a devoted son. They were deplorable. This was not caregiving. It was a conspiracy to defraud his sister and take advantage of his father at his weakest moment." Tears began to stream down my face, silent tears of relief and validation. Mark squeezed my hand under the table. "Therefore," the judge concluded, her voice ringing with finality, "this court finds that there is overwhelming evidence of undue influence. The will dated October 28th is hereby declared invalid. The court orders that the previous will, dated June 4th, 2015, which divides the estate equally between the two children, be admitted to probate as the true and final will of the deceased. It was over. I had won. A wave of exhaustion so profound it was almost dizzying washed over me. The judge's words had not only restored my inheritance, they had restored the truth. They had cleared my name, and more importantly, they had cleared my father's. In the aftermath, my world slowly began to find a new equilibrium. Ethan, shamed and exposed, became a pariah. He got his original half of the inheritance, but he had lost everything else. Our relationship was, of course, irrevocably destroyed. I haven't spoken a single word to him since that day in court, and I don't think I ever will. Some betrayals are too deep to ever be repaired. The legal victory didn't feel like a celebration. It couldn't bring my father back. It couldn't erase the pain of his last months or the memory of his manipulated words, but it brought a sense of peace. I took my share of the inheritance and used it to buy Ethan out of his half of our father's house. I couldn't bear the thought of him being there. Now this house is mine. It's no longer a place of painful memories, but a sanctuary where I can connect with the father I knew and loved, the man he was before the illness and the poison. Last weekend, Mark and I spent the day in the backyard, the same yard I played in as a child. We were planting a garden, turning over the soil to make way for new life. As I pressed a new rose bush into the rich earth, I felt a sense of closure. The inheritance was never the point. The house, the money. They were just symbols. The real victory was taking back the truth from the man who tried to steal it. It was about rebuilding a foundation of love and memory that my brother tried to demolish, ensuring that the legacy my father left behind was one of justice, not of lies.